Okay, now we're going to talk about changes in sculpture during the Gothic period, and we are going to start back at Chartres. We talk about Chartres a lot in a lot of the different areas within the Gothic unit because it's just so emblematic of so many of the changes happening. So this is the royal portal at Chartres, and it should be familiar to you because, not this particular portal, but basically the design, because it's quite similar to what we looked at when we were in the Romanesque period and we were kind of looking at the different elements of these portals going into churches. So the portal is the door, but like the whole area around the door, right? So here's our tympanum, which you'll recognize. We have Christ in Majesty here, just like we did in a lot of the portals we looked at for the Romanesque. So here's Christ in Majesty, he has the mandorla, he has the cruciform halo, he has the symbols of the gospel writers. So we have Matthew, we have Luke, we have John, we have Mark, all here. We have our archivolts, which also have sculpture. We have our jam statues. So we can see all these familiar elements. The idea of these jam statues and having them be individualized figures like this really comes from Saint Denis. So we looked at Saint Denis when we were talking about French architecture and Abbot Sugar, all that stuff. It's then adopted here, this idea of these figures. This is called the Royal Portal because the figures are all kings and queens in these jam sculptures. So they're kings and queens from the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. The archivolts on the right portal over here depict 7 female personifications of the liberal arts, which is kind of interesting. And at their feet, down below, we have learned men from antiquity. Okay, so kind of a shout out to the classical ideas from the Greek and Roman periods of culture, basically. They symbolize human knowledge, which theory and other intellectuals of the time believed led to true faith. So there's this really tight connection between the study of the liberal arts and Christian theology at this time in the Middle Ages. So that's why we see this kind of thing that seems a little bit secular, but we see this in quite a lot of sculpture work at the time for churches. It's kind of a visual summa, like a encyclopedia of knowledge, basically. So these several liberal arts are grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music theory, and astronomy. So the core is grammar, logic, rhetoric, and arithmetic. The trivium is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then the quadrivium is the arithmetic, geometry, music theory, and astronomy. Okay. The capitals, so these are the capitals across all 3 doors, show scenes from the life of the Virgin and the life of Christ. So as I said when we were talking about stained glass, the life of the Virgin becomes more of a central topic of sculpture and stained glass and other artistic representation during the Gothic period. She becomes kind of a big focus within the Christian faith. The left tympanum over here, we have Christ's ascension. So he's flanked by angels here, and he's ascending whole body into heaven. The archivolts on this one are really interesting. So they depict the signs of the zodiac, which maybe seems a little strange to us in contemporary times because that doesn't seem like something that necessarily goes with Christianity. But that's not the case in the Middle Ages, that we see a lot of zodiac representation in religious imagery. So we have the zodiac signs, and then we have scenes depicting various labor associated with different times of the year. These are symbols of the cosmic and the earthly world. So this is to kind of show that Christ is of both spaces, of the cosmic world up above, the heavens, which is what the zodiac symbols are supposed to symbolize, and then the labors of man as we toil on earth. Okay, so the humanity of Christ as well. We see that kind of combination of zodiac and then labors done during different times of the year in things called the Book of Hours, which we've seen some examples of those before. They're a kind of manuscript that have different passages from the Judeo-Christian Bible and prayers and things that you do at different times of the day and different times of the year. And often to show what time of the year it is, they'll have the zodiac symbols up above to show, like, here's a symbol for Capricorn, so you know that you're in early January or late December. That kind of thing. Okay. The second coming, or Christ in majesty here, is in the central tympanum. So here he is enthroned. We have the symbols of the evangelists, of the guys who wrote the Gospels around him. I already talked about that. On the lintel, we also have the signs of the four evangelists. Again, we have on the lintel right here, we have the 24 elders of the apocalypse. We have the 12 disciples appear kind of around Christ here, or on the lintel on the very edges here. The right portal is Cetus Sapientus in the tympanum, which is scenes from Christ's childhood in the lintel, and then Christ enthroned on the Virgin Mary's lap here. Mary has a very central role at Chartres. It is called Our Lady, Notre Dame. She becomes very popular and again is a very prominent figure. All of our jam statues on this portal are Old Testament kings and queens, so they're the royal ancestors of Christ. Figuratively and literally, they are supporting the New Testament, which is above. So we have our Old Testament figures here supporting the New Testament above, which just shows that connectivity of the Christian Bible. We have seen this kind of thing before. They're kind of like caryatids, right? When we think back all the way to ancient Greece earlier in the semester when we looked at the Erechtheion on the Acropolis and we saw those caryatid, those maiden figures where human forms replaced the columns. So this is kind of a similar idea, except these are not detached standalone in the round sculptures like the caryatids. These are attached, so they're just very, very high relief sculptures. We start seeing a little bit more leaning toward naturalism, still not super natural or realistic looking, but we see a little more of an interest in naturalism. We start seeing a little bit more of the personality of each figure. They look more like individuals here. So this is the porch of the martyrs, also at Chartres. And here again, we can kind of see a little bit more development in terms of the individual style and a little bit more of this three-dimensionality as well, and a little more interest in naturalism. So these are a really good example of the high Gothic. So as we're moving through time and progressing forward in time in the Gothic, so this is like between 1220 and 1230 when these are made. They're more independent from the wall. They're more in the round, even though they're still attached. Theodore, if we look at St. Theodore here, he's standing in the contrapposto stance, that classical stance. And these shifts seem kind of small, but it really is a big deal stylistically, and we start seeing more attention being paid looking back to the classical period and its influence on the arts as a whole. Okay, so now we're going to go to Amiens. This is a figure that I really like. This figure, the Trumeau figure in the middle, is called the Beau Dieu. That means the beautiful God. So this is the central portal at the front of Amiens, and again, the sculpture is almost in the round. He's almost could stand on his own, but he's still attached to the back to the Trumeau, this middle space between the doors. And I just like the idea of his name being the beautiful God. This is what he's come to be known, and this is a portrait of Jesus. People traveled from all over to see this beautiful statue. People fell in love with this statue. It was considered really quite striking and handsome for the time. which I think is kind of funny. Okay, let's look at some of the other elements here. We have this interesting architectural canopy above his head. You'll see this on the side sculptures as well. This is another thing in the High Gothic that we see becoming a popular kind of element within sculpture. So we have our figure, and then we have him kind of in under this little architectural canopy to place him in his own kind of architectural space. He is holding the Bible in one hand, and he has a symbol of blessing in his other hand. So he's blessing those that enter the cathedral. The scarier Last Judgment version of Christ is placed above in the tympanum here. So we're kind of doing both. It's kind of the carrot and the stick. We have the nice, beautiful God blessing you and welcoming you to the church, and then the scary, like, judgment God up above. So they're kind of doing both. If we look down at his feet, this part of it I also think is kind of cute. He's standing on a lion and a dragon. They are representing the evils of the world and how Christ kind of conquers the chaos and the evils of the world, which is another thing that we see as a holdover from the Romanesque, this idea of monsters or beasts representing the chaos in the world and kind of the chaos without religion, basically. He's supposed to give this image of hope and salvation. He's bearded, he's benevolent. This becomes one of his standard kind of ways that Jesus is portrayed in the Gothic era. So he kind of replaces this youthful early Christian version of portrayal of Jesus, and also the kind of stern Byzantine Pantocrator, like really angry looking Jesus. So we have this kind of handsome, approachable beau deux. So here's a close-up on him. You can see the lion and the dragon. All right. We're also going to look, this is at Rheims. So here we have a big difference in the portals at Rheims. We have, as I said, when we were looking at French architecture, religious architecture in general, the tympanums are stained glass now. So that whole area that used to be sculpture is now stained glass, which kind of frees up the masons a little bit to get even more elaborate and detailed with what they do with the jamb sculptures. So here are our sculptures. There are jamb statues on the right side of the central doorway at Rheims, and this is portraying the Visitation. So we have Mary visiting her cousin Elizabeth, and her cousin Elizabeth is the mother of John the Baptist, so this is one of those stories that's popular to be depicted. So Mary is pregnant with Jesus, and Elizabeth is pregnant with John the Baptist in this. This is from the book of Luke, and then next to it we have the Annunciation story. So this is Mary being visited by the angel Gabriel, who's telling her she's going to have the Son of God. You'll notice these are kind of different. They were likely made by different sculptors and made quite some time apart from each other. So all the sculptures in this doorway were created between 1230 and 1255, a 25-year period. These are a little more simple. We still have a little more naturalism. We have very three-dimensional figures, even though they're still technically engaged. They're technically connected to the wall behind. We have more attention to the drapery and how it relates to the body. But look at these. These are clearly later. Even more naturalized, more detail in the faces. Look at all the detail in that face. Look at all the detail of the draperies. So they just, as this develops through the High Gothic, we get more and more realism being added into the sculptures. Okay, this is a very famous late Gothic sculpture. So this is the Virgin and Child. She's sometimes called the Virgin of Paris. And she's right outside Notre Dame, the Notre Dame that's in Paris. And it's very elegant, it's very emblematic of what sculpture starts to look like in France in the late Gothic. You can see it's more naturalized. She looks like a person. She has this very gentle kind of S curve to her body. That is something that we see in sculptures, particularly sculptures of the Virgin Mary of this time. You can see the relationship between her drapery, the drapery of her clothing, and her body underneath. Just overall more naturalized and also very beautiful, kind of very tender feeling instead of this really solemn, severe kind of look. So again, this humanization of the sculptures, which we see in this time period. All right, I also want to look at some secular sculpture. So this is called the Castle of Love, and this is the lid of a jewelry box. So there are also secular objects that are carved at this time. A lot more money is poured into religious architecture and adornments at this time, but we do have secular work as well. This one is inspired by literature of the time called The Romance of the Rose. It's a poem by Guillemard de Lorey, and it's written in 1225. So the story of this is Gothic knights attempt to capture love's fortress by shooting flowers from their bows and hurling baskets of flowers to try and capture the personification of love, the fortress of love. The sides of the box illustrate the allegory of the unicorn, which is a symbol of virtue. So this is just another example of relief sculpture at this time. This is made out of ivory, so we can see that the interest in ivory, which is an influence from the Byzantine, is still prominent in this time. We have some fairly sort of naturalistic looking depictions. They're not quite as pronounced and quite as realistic as what we're seeing in, say, our lovely Virgin of Paris over here. They're fairly contemporaneous to each other, but you can see the kind of detail worked in here, and I like to just show you an example of non-religious works. Okay, so that's it for sculpture for now. Next we'll talk about what's happening in the Gothic outside of France. So we'll look at England and the perpendicular style, Germany in the Gothic, and then we'll look back into France at the Rayonnant and flamboyant styles.